Well, let's go back for a second on digital media, because digital media goes back to the days of emails and the internet. That made a huge difference. It really meant that when you were abroad as an ambassador, all of your officers could be sending messages all over the place. And it really flattened out the organization. It changed the organization quite significantly. And as for, I mean, the internet, and we'll talk about social media in a second, but as for the internet, it had an extraordinary effect. My favorite story is that in 1996, I think it was, the Japanese embassy in Lima, Peru was seized by a group, a rebel group. And I remember I got a telephone call at 11 o'clock at night. They told me this, and that there were 6 Canadians inside. And I said, who is this group? They said, it's the MRTA. Who are the MRTA? What do they want? Said, first thing tomorrow morning, we'll have an answer for you. We've got a team in here tonight. And I said, well, I hope so, because I'm meeting the minister at 9 o'clock. Well, I went down the next morning. I just come back from a trip and went on to my computer in the basement of our house, went to Alta Vista as it was then, the Google of its time, and I found the communique. Printed a copy in color, and I went to my office, didn't say anything to anybody. I went into the operations center. They all were long faces. I'm sorry, we just can't get through to anybody. We don't really know any more about this group. I said, it's not a problem. I've just printed out for myself their communique. And that went like wildfire through the Department of Foreign Affairs. That, my God, the deputy minister himself, goes on the internet and looks for information. So, I mean, that's all part of this digital revolution. Now we've gone to a whole new phase, in my view, above all with Twitter, but not only with Twitter. Because now we've got ways of listening to people who we don't even know, particularly people having conversations about something. For example, I did this when I was actually on holiday with what was happening in Tahrir Square, and as the situation in Libya developed. I made all sorts of friends. I mean, even at this very conference, I'm meeting people that I only knew from the Twitter world. So, I mean, Twitter can be a way of obviously bringing information in. It can also be a way of getting information out for government, and not much different than the CIC. If you do something, you want to be seen as having done it. You want people to be able to read what you've written or watch whatever interview you've conducted. But where it gets really interesting is when there's an interaction amongst people. And I can think of a couple of examples. I'll just cite one, and that is with respect to Syria, where I got into a discussion with a group of the Syrian diaspora, and some people I think actually in Syria, but who were masking their identity, about how best to put pressure on Bashar al-Assad. And having been in government, this is something I know a little bit about. And in any event, I worked with them to try to develop a strategy, which has now succeeded. I'm not saying because of the work that I did, but at least I tried to advise them on how to do this, that has cut off Syria's ability to export oil to the 4 refineries that are capable of processing their high sulfur type of oil. So, the social media provides ways of creating networks. We all know that. But they can be networks of think tanks, governments, NGOs, local people, and international people. So this means that diplomacy works in a fundamentally different kind of way. And the diplomats of today's age have got to be on top of this. They can't resist it. They've got to be on top of it and see it as an opportunity. There are a variety of ways. One, and I see it particularly with the British, but also with the Americans. I mean, the British, some of their heads of mission now are putting out blogs. and they're really quite good. The Americans, I mean, I read, maybe the last one I read was a couple of weeks ago by the American ambassador in Damascus, which was very frank, very candid. I don't know, to be honest with you, in Canada whether that will fly. You know, we're dealing in a world in which there's a great deal of centralized control in the Prime Minister's office. That's not a secret to anybody. And I'm not sure they would be comfortable with this kind of openness on the part of people abroad. I mean, after all, there was and maybe still is a rule where if you're an ambassador abroad, you've got to clear your speech with Ottawa before you give it. I find this stunning.
There still is.
I've given, well, there you are. There still is. I mean, to me, it's just, I've given so many speeches abroad when I was an ambassador, which I was for 8 years abroad in a couple of different postings. So, you know, to me, it goes, what's happening now by way of centralized control goes totally against the direction in which this technology is taking us.
Absolutely. Now, I want to switch the focus a little bit. And yesterday, during his address, Paul Martin brought up the idea that we think of the G20 as an economic financial institution, but it could actually play a role in promoting things like R2P. Could you elaborate on whether that's possible?
No, I'd like to do that, because I was Prime Minister Chrétien's Sherpa for the G7 and G8 in the mid-90s. And it was an interesting experience because there would be the 7 or 8 leaders around the table, plus one person each well behind them. And what really struck me was the extent to which these people knew each other, called each other by their first name, and developed, and I think this is what Prime Minister Martin was talking about, the capacity to empathize with somebody, with another person. And you saw that, and you saw the way they struck deals amongst each other. I mean, I could say something to the Prime Minister about some issue, and he kind of wonder about it, but if he heard about it from one of his counterparts, like President Chirac, it was a different order of information. So I think and I think a lot of people outside government don't understand this, but the utility of these leaders knowing each other, being together, spending significant amounts of time with each other is really important. Now, the G20, of course, is the world's premier economic forum, so described. So it's there to talk about economic issues. But the reality is leaders spend time together, you know, at dinner or having a cup of coffee afterwards, and they circulate. And that's the opportunity, to give you an example of how one can move from the economic into the non-economic, where leaders of the US, Britain, France, Canada, I hope, can talk to their Russian and Chinese counterparts about Syria and why it's imperative to tighten the sanctions on Syria. It's not on the agenda of the G20, but it's one of the things that they can talk about and try to explain to their Russian and Chinese counterparts, you know, why the killing that's going on in Syria just can't be allowed to continue. It's not coming to any natural end, and therefore it really is necessary to tighten sanctions. Well, even if it isn't on the G20 agenda, the leaders can informally talk about it.
Now, from the perspective of Canadian leadership, I think there's a consensus that Canada's power in the world is declining as countries like Brazil and China and India rise. Would it be to the benefit of Canada's international reputation if we use something like R2P, which is a doctrine that we invented, to really promote our international reputation?
That's a good question. To be very clear, I think it is the fact that other countries have gone up. Not so much that we have come down, but other countries are now are of major importance in the world. And if one was going to create a G7 or G8 today, you know, we wouldn't make that cut.
Right.
So we're lucky to be where we are. But what that means is that we've got to use the opportunity that is provided by our membership in summits, for example, to push Canadian interests. And there's got to be something distinctive about that. The interesting thing is, of course, that the present government took a very strong line on Libya. We've We've flown 10% of the missions in Libya. I don't think that was seen as part of responsibility to protect, or somebody may have later on decided to attach that label. But it wasn't part of the concept. It seems to me that this government is much less comfortable with the whole idea of human security, and that would include responsibility to protect. And they see this as somehow a liberal ideology or a liberal hangover. Well, I think that's, quite frankly, ridiculous. I think there has been continuity in Canadian foreign policy. I think that what Prime Minister Mulroney did was really basically consistent with the evolution of Canadian foreign policy over many, many years. I think the present government has moved off it. Where it will now go, that it's got a majority, I don't know.